In ancient Sparta, if a baby was born with dwarfism, they were tossed off a cliff. Not metaphorically, literally. Cliff. Bye-bye. Meanwhile, in Renaissance Europe, dwarves were kept as royal pets, dressed like dolls, and paraded around court for laughs, like living bobbleheads with no rights. But in ancient Egypt, totally different story. Because while the rest of the ancient world was busy being horrible, the Egyptians were like, wait, you're short? Fantastic. You're hired? Here's your golden necklace. Now guard the pharaoh's jewelry. No joke. Dwarves in ancient Egypt weren't just accepted. They were respected, revered. They held elite jobs, served in the royal household, and even had their own god. So what made the Egyptians see dignity where others saw a sideshow? Let's dig in, because it's time to explore why being a dwarf in ancient Egypt was weirdly one of the best gigs in the Bronze Age. To understand why dwarves had it so good in ancient Egypt, you need to understand what the Egyptians actually cared about. Spoiler, it wasn't abes or height or golden ratios. It was Maat, the sacred law of balance, cosmic order, and everything running like a well-oiled chariot wheel. Maat wasn't just an idea, it was a lifestyle. It governed everything from the way the Nile flooded to how you arranged your breakfast offering to a falcon-headed god. It meant harmony, predictability, and everyone and everything knowing its place. So while other ancient cultures were out there chasing physical perfection like it was an Olympic sport, the Egyptians were more like, does it contribute to stability? Does it keep the system running? Great, you're hired. In that worldview, physical difference wasn't a flaw. It was just another variable in the grand equation. You weren't chaos. You were an intentional part of the design. You weren't a mistake. You were the gods showing off their creative range. Like, here's a guy with 4 elbows. Balance it out with this guy. 3 feet, 10 inches, and perfect at accounting. And that's where dwarves come in, not as outliers, but as assets. Because when your entire society is built around order and someone walks in with the ability to make gold jewelry for the gods without sneezing on it, you don't question their height, you offer them a job. If you're looking for proof that dwarves weren't just accepted in ancient Egypt, but actually thrived, meet Seneb, high official, estate manager, priest, and about 3 feet tall. Seneb lived during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu. Yes, the same Khufu who built the Great Pyramid. And somehow, while everyone else was busy hauling limestone blocks and dying at 30, Seneb was climbing the social ladder in sandals. He held titles like Overseer of Palace Dwarves, Priest of the Mortuary Cult, and Head of Linen Production, which basically means he was trusted with sacred rituals, estate logistics, and possibly Pharaoh's laundry. That's elite-level multitasking for someone half the size of his co-workers. But what really cements Seneb's status is his statue, a beautiful, serene carving, showing him seated proudly with his full-sized wife and their 2 children. No weird proportions, no attempt to hide his stature, just a confident man, smiling like he already knows history will remember him. And history did. When Seneb died, he wasn't buried in some dusty village graveyard. He was laid to rest in a custom tomb within the necropolis at Giza, dangerously close to pyramid real estate, which in ancient Egypt is the equivalent of waterfront property in Beverly Hills. Seneb was short. His resume, not so much. Seneb may have been a high-ranking human, but he wasn't the only short king in the Egyptian world. Some of the gods themselves were built like bouncers at toddler height, and no one found that odd. Quite the opposite. To the ancient Egyptians, being short wasn't strange. It meant you might be halfway to divine. Enter Bes, the dwarf-shaped god of childbirth, beer, music, dreams, knives, and spontaneous protective violence. Bes wasn't subtle. He didn't whisper prayers or float down on lotus petals. He showed up loud, wild-eyed, with a lion skin on his back, and his tongue sticking out, ready to scare away demons and deliver a healthy baby in the same breath. He guarded sleeping families, blessed pregnancies, and possibly invented the ancient Egyptian rave. Bes didn't walk into rooms. He burst in like a one-man festival wearing a lion skin and scaring demons with jazz hands. Then there's Pataikos, a dwarf-like protective figure carved into amulets and figurines. He looked small, but he carried knives, magic, and healing power, often depicted standing on crocodiles like, "Don't worry, I got this." Egyptians wore him for protection, hung him in homes, and placed him near the sick. Because when things went sideways, you didn't want a tall statue that just stood there. You wanted a pocket-sized guardian who actually did something. To the Egyptians, dwarves weren't anomalies. They were signals, living reminders that power and mystery often came in unusual packaging. In a world where most people were swinging picks or hauling stone under a melting sun, dwarves had a very different career path. They were prized for jobs that required precision, patience, and hands small enough to handle sacred miniatures without crushing them like papyrus. Think goldsmiths, jewelers, textile specialists, ritual dancers, and personal attendants to the elite. If it sparkled, wriggled, or involved delicate work next to sacred objects, there was probably a dwarf doing it, and doing it well. Many were employed directly in temples, where they served as ritual specialists and ceremonial assistants in festivals, processions, and purification rites. In other words, they were trusted to stand next to the gods without messing up the lighting. It wasn't just about small hands, it was about trust. You don't let just anyone handle your divine wigs or apply coal to the statue of Osiris. If your fingers were steady enough to sew sacred leopard skin robes for a crocodile priest, you got promoted. If not, back to fish-gutting duty. If you were a dwarf in most ancient societies, getting remembered in art usually meant becoming a visual punchline. Oversized heads, bent limbs, and poses that screamed, "Look at this guy." In courts, from Persia to medieval Europe, dwarves were costumed, mocked, and paraded like living cartoons. But not in Egypt. Egyptian art didn't distort, it documented. Dwarves were portrayed with accurate proportions, dressed in fine linen, shown standing tall, or at least as tall as they were, next to nobles, workers, and even royalty. No exaggeration, no animal features, no forced comedy, just stone-carved swagger in linen robes. And this dignity wasn't limited to tomb walls. Even medical texts, like the famous Edwin Smith papyrus, referenced dwarfism in clinical observational language. Not curses, not omens, just anatomy and diagnosis, which for a society that painted gods with falcon heads and lion legs is surprisingly rational. They didn't mythologize your body, they measured it. It was a world before caricatures. You didn't get mocked, you got painted. And if you weren't being painted, chances are you were performing sacred duties in a temple. Egypt didn't do court jesters, it did rituals. Dwarves weren't tucked into palace corners for amusement. They were placed at the heart of sacred festivals and religious ceremonies. Their job wasn't to make the pharaoh laugh, it was to stand beside priests during incense offerings, help prepare divine statues, and ensure every event ran according to Maat, the cosmic script that made the universe tick. These weren't background roles, they were trusted positions in the carefully choreographed theater of divine worship. And in a world where screwing up a ritual could curse the harvest or offend a crocodile god, trust mattered. Other cultures put dwarves in jester hats. Egypt handed them incense and said, "Don't mess up the afterlife," or the sacred cat. In ancient Egypt, your career wasn't determined by your dimensions, it was determined by your utility. There's no evidence that height, limb proportions, or overall build blocked anyone from landing a role. What mattered was whether you could do the job, not whether you could reach the top shelf. Dwarves appear on official payrolls as craftsmen in royal workshops, as household staff in noble estates, and as ritual assistants in temple ceremonies. They were paid, titled, and recorded, not hidden, not gifted, and definitely not ornamental. Egyptian bureaucracy didn't care how tall you were, it cared whether you could grind pigment, carry sacred tools, or manage a linen inventory without turning it into a cursed toga party. Ancient HR wasn't asking your height, they were checking if you could hold a gold tray without dropping it on the high priest. Not every dwarf in ancient Egypt was gilded, titled, or trusted with the pharaoh's incense. Most didn't oversee rituals or pose for statues next to gods, and yet they weren't banished to the margins of society either. In fact, based on the art and records left behind, most dwarves in Egypt lived something much more radical, a normal life. They show up in tomb scenes, not as symbols or jokes, but as workers, weaving textiles, feeding livestock, tending gardens, managing estate chores, and assisting with kitchen tasks. in elite households. They weren't hidden behind palace walls or confined to obscure shrines. They were present, visibly, regularly, in the daily life of the nation. Imagine it, a dwarf seated on a low stool, spinning flax fibers into linen thread while being loudly heckled by a goose, or feeding sacred ibises under the watchful eye of some high priest who just dropped his incense burner for the 3rd time this week. These aren't stories we have by name, but they're all over the walls, the kinds of scenes that fill tombs with snapshots of real labor, real contribution, and real community. And that's the key here. Community. Being a dwarf didn't mark you as a freak, a problem, or even a curiosity. It just meant you were a little shorter than the guy next to you, while you both cursed the heat and scrubbed dishes for a temple full of overfed scribes. In other cultures, being born different meant isolation, mockery, or mythologizing. You were either locked away, turned into a living warning, or elevated to some symbolic oddity. In Egypt, it meant learning to bake bread for 300 priests before noon, dodging crocodile bites on laundry day, and reminding your supervisor again that the baboon is not doing his fair share. And that's how you know dwarves were integrated. They had the right to complain about the work. You don't whine about chores unless you belong. You don't argue with the guy next to you about who left the oil lamps burning unless that guy sees you as part of the team. You didn't get locked in a tower. You didn't get shipped off to the freak tent. Worst case, you were folding laundry next to a guy with a pet baboon who definitely wasn't pulling his weight on laundry day. And let's be honest, probably stole your figs too. So no, not every dwarf in ancient Egypt had a tomb by the pyramids or a list of sacred titles long enough to wrap a mummy. But they weren't erased. They weren't hidden. They were there, doing the work, living the life, and occasionally yelling at birds. You know you're part of the community when you're allowed to be grumpy about chores. By now, you've met the whole cast. Bez, the lion skin-wearing god who protected babies and banished nightmares with jazz hands. Seneb, the high-ranking official who ran palace operations and probably had a more stable work-life balance than most of us. And then there's everyone else. The unnamed dwarf spinning thread in the estate workshop, the one chopping onions in the temple kitchen, or the guy trying to scrub limestone off a sacred ibis without losing a finger. What ties them all together isn't their size. It's the fact that ancient Egypt, in its weird, meticulous, sometimes crocodile-worshipping way, actually made room for them. Egypt didn't flatten people into neat little categories. It didn't shove you into a role based on your birth defect, body shape, or general oddness. This was a society that believed in sacred beetles, painted the sky as a goddess, and took advice from baboons. There was space for everything, from eccentric gods to sacred barbers. And if you happened to be 3 feet tall with steady hands and temple-grade work ethic, you had a place in the cosmic machine. So what did it take to succeed in ancient Egypt as a dwarf? Steady hands, sacred vibes, possibly the ability to bless a fish. What didn't matter? Your height, or whether your proportions matched the statue of Ra. You could serve the pharaoh, you could serve a god, you could serve beer at a fertility festival and still end up immortalized in stone. And sure, not every dwarf had a tomb or a temple gig, but they had something far rarer in the ancient world. A role, a record, and the ability to exist without being erased. And that brings us back to Seneb, the man, the myth, the linen tycoon. He wasn't born royal, he didn't build a pyramid, but he ended up buried beside one in fine limestone with his wife, his titles, and a smug little statue that's still smiling 4,000 years later. The dude practically photobombed eternity. Seneb stood 3 feet tall and died closer to the Great Pyramid than most of the architects who built it. Now that's what you call a legendary short king. If you enjoyed this dive into the short kings of the Nile, give this video a like so the algorithm doesn't bury us deeper than Seneb's tomb, and subscribe for more weird, wonderful, and slightly dusty corners of ancient Egypt.